IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. Given the pandemic, state capacity has been a major issue. And because states can't always be everywhere managing quarantines and enforcing lockdowns, technology has been a massive supplement to state capacity. And we've seen technology stepping in as interventions, helping state capacity by apps like Arogya Setu, by drones. And there's a bunch of things that technology broadly does that helps states in this current time. And to discuss this, we have Utkarsh, Prateek and Sapni, who have worked on a document regarding state capacity, which will be out next week, and how tech interventions play a role in managing the pandemic. And I just want to get right into it. And Prateek, can you tell me what the document is about and how tech interventions are being studied in the document?
Sure, yeah. And as you summed it up, Rohan, the technological interventions, they can be designed, developed quickly. They have an important supporting role to play in broader efforts to manage the pandemic. What we did is we looked at 5 major categories that we've seen where a lot of these responses have come, where these technological interventions have come. These were contact tracing, quarantine management, risk determination, your general healthcare information, informatory kind of apps. And the last one was, apps pertaining specifically to issuing e-passes and that. So what we essentially did was we developed something called the Viability Rating, which underneath that looks at, the overall idea of a viability rating is to tell you whether a given intervention or a given technology or an app has the capacity to complement your pandemic management efforts, right? And under the hood, what we've done is we've looked at 3 aspects of it: population penetration, which is what portion of your serviceable audience an intervention can cater to, right? So, for example, if you're looking at something that's an internet plus Bluetooth based solution like we're seeing with contact tracing, what percentage of people actually have the compatible devices that can take advantage of that, right? The second one that we looked at is privacy, which is how well a given intervention will operate against principles of data protection. Now, I know that's a little abstract, so we'll get into what we looked at specifically later on in the conversation. And the third was effectiveness, which is the ability of the technology to achieve its result, right? How good it is. Basically, does it do what it says on the can, right? And along each of these, on each of these 3 criteria, we rated them on a very simple 3-point scale, color coded, which was since red, green, blue was taken. We went with cyan, for something that rated high or good, yellow for something that was rated medium or average, and magenta that was that roughly translates to low or poor. But yeah, that at a broad level of the overall framework that we used.
So for people who are like me, cyan is a color which is very similar to green, and magenta is a color which is very similar to red, and yellow is obviously yellow.
No, actually that's a very good point, Utkarsh, because what we've used is cyan as per the document, but a lot of the color literate might think of it more as a teal. But yeah, for let's just call it cyan.
Thank you.
All right. Now that we're past an extremely important pivot, let's talk about something that you mentioned, Prateek, data protection. And that's especially important to me because I work a lot in this area. And when you say that it appears a tech intervention sort of adheres to some principles of data protection, what exactly did you guys look at? Is it purpose limitation? Is it use limitation? How do you guys measure that particular parameter?
So basically what we've looked at is 5 broad parameters to analyze whether some tech intervention scores well on the privacy scale. So broadly what we have looked at is whether an intervention sticks well to the purpose limitation and whether the permissions it seeks on the App Store. So we've looked at, because of Google, Android being the more available and accessible OS, we've looked at what sort of permissions does an app take when vis-a-vis the intent of the app. So in the case of a e-pass app, an app which gives e-passes, we've seen what sort of interventions and data does the particular app say that it collects vis-a-vis what its intent is. Further, we've also looked at whether data retention, whether the privacy policy looks at data retention and how it looks at deals with data retention and who stores. Furthermore, the oversight accountability on the data collected. So where it is stored and who is liable, or if there is any liability on the data stored. And also moving back to the permission sought versus the data intent on the data collected, we've also looked at the possibility of de-anonymization. That is with respect to having the multiple data points which these interventions collect. So it's now a common understanding that hard anonymization is not a real possibility. With as limited as 10 to 15 data points, you can almost with 99% accuracy come to a conclusion of who is the real owner of the data. In that circumstance, we've also looked at how an app or an intervention fares against the possibility of de-anonymization of data. And all of this works within the framework of having a privacy policy. So that is one of our major considerations we've looked at, whether or not there is a privacy policy. And all of this comes out of having or not having a privacy policy, in addition to the media reportage which we've seen of how data is collected, if there is any other precautions, like in the case of Arogya Setu, although we do not have a lot of data regarding these aspects which we have looked at in the privacy policy. But there is much more clarity through the protocol that came in. So that is how we've looked at data protection through this analysis and privacy.
All right. So I've read this document with great interest, and it's actually a great piece of work. And I just want to look at the equity angle and talk a little bit more about that here. Because as you understand that tech is not just a tool that can be used for good or for bad or can be given to everyone, but when you are managing a global pandemic and there are going to be nationwide implications for how you use technology, how does the equity angle play in here? How did the document look at this, and what conclusions did you have?
Yeah, and just to clarify, we couldn't outright determine equity, so which is why we've called it population penetration, right? But it's a good indicator to how equity would play out, right? And with population penetration, what we basically did is, like I sort of alluded to earlier, is we've determined which is the baseline for people to have access to some of these interventions, right? And we've looked at this across. We've looked at 30 different types of initiatives or apps split between India and international ones. And what we basically we were able to conclude that, look, your internet access is your main differentiator, right? That's going to tell you whether a person is able to benefit from this intervention or not. And then there are finer points, such as whether they have the compatible devices of for example, for contact tracing, you need to have a phone that supports Bluetooth Low Energy, right? If some of the quarantine management ones looked at use GPS, so you need to have a phone that has GPS as well, right? Now, and what we did in this case was, again, high level estimates kind of tell you that India roughly has somewhere between 350 to 450 million smartphones, depending on which source of data you're looking at, right? But what we were also able to do was look at data that TRAI puts out in terms of your actual number of internet connections per 100 people, by service area that they've called it, but you can make a connection from there to a state or a union territory. All right. And also based on census data that we have for population between rural and urban, we were actually able to get a good estimate, rough estimate of, by state, what percentage of people would be able to benefit from intervention or not, right? From one of these initiatives or not. And we actually have an illustration of that in the document itself, which on the assumption that of the people who have internet connections, about 60% of them will also have access to a compatible device. Now, this is we've been a little more optimistic than some of the figures that Counterpoint Research and CCI Insight have put out. I think CCI Insight said about 60 to 70% of the Indian population will be ruled out. And Counterpoint had said 50% of devices will be compatible. So we've given it, we've been a little more optimistic in our assessment, and we said, okay, maybe 60% will have compatible devices, and we've actually then been able to get some sort of estimate of how this will look by state as well.
All right, thanks. So while I was going through it, one of the other major things that stuck out to me was that while you're putting all these tech interventions through the viability rating, I realized that so much of quarantine enforcement and privacy is actually negatively related, as in, is it magenta the color? Yeah, it's magenta, right? So all of quarantine enforcement comes under magenta, under the privacy parameter. And that means that privacy is not something that's actively considered while you're enforcing a quarantine. So, is that, would you say that is because of the very nature of quarantine enforcement? And have there been any exceptions as to why you gave a particular quarantine enforcement method slightly better privacy rating than you did the others?
So yes, generally the idea about balancing privacy with a sort of what in epidemiology terms they call health surveillance, it is difficult because there are the two aspects of those two aspects are really contradictory to each other. And in the scheme, when we have analyzed, almost all of them have fared pretty poorly on privacy. The one reason for this is the continuous use of GPS and continuous use of location tracking. But then it again relates to the fact that there are questions about effectiveness of it as well. So hence, when there are no proofs of concept and it's very gullible to manipulation. Adding to that, the amount of data you collect, and there are apps like in Karnataka, the Quarantine Watch app, which Karnataka government uses to check on people in quarantine. What it essentially does is it asks for selfies, and there are such highly intrusive mechanisms which are deeply rooted in almost all of these quarantine management apps. Hence, looking at it through the privacy angle, again, through the points which I'd already earlier mentioned about how the data retention becomes an issue, how there is no oversight accountability. And that is something which repeats in almost all of these apps, that there is hardly any accountability on this extensive amount of data that is collected by these quarantine management apps, particularly in the case that they're extremely intrusive. Hence, almost all of them have fared very poorly on the privacy scale.
All right. So thanks. I also see that Arogya Setu in particular, in the slide doc, comes across multiple tech interventions. It's not just a tool to, let's say, enforce quarantines, but it's also a tool that disseminates information regarding how our country is performing in the pandemic. So I want to sort of also broadly ask, in your research, did you also find other apps that had such a wide mandate as this one? And we could say that our demography is such that it's better to have one app across all platforms that takes care of such a massive mandate. But are there any similar parallels that we can draw from other countries as well?
No, I don't believe we've come across any of those in the list that we had started tracking. Now, of course, I think, just to clarify, maybe between the time we record this and it comes out, something might come up. But and on the contrary, I think we're actually seeing moves asking for these apps to be purpose limited and split as far as possible, right? So I think in that sense, India is an exception where we are putting a lot of our, I don't particularly like this phrase, but we are putting all our eggs in one basket, or we are putting all our data in one app.
I think I'd like to add to it, to the particular question that if there are apps which do multiple functions. There are, but again, like Prateek said, the range of use cases it covers, I think there probably might be a one or two of in our entire analysis. One would be an app which the Indonesian government uses, which probably has somewhat a similar approach, but then it again fares extremely poorly on considerations of privacy. And also initially an app which the Nagaland government used to try and control and contain the virus. But the overall understanding we get is, as Prateek said once again, that putting all your data in one app probably might not be the best option you give with considerations of privacy and effectiveness.
Okay, and also because from what I understand, the context in India and Arogya Setu itself is a fairly unique app because it has so much to do. How would you affect if you had to draw up an overall rating? Would you rank it as magenta, cyan, or yellow? I hope I'm not pushing towards cyan, but yeah.
Well, you have read the document for that. So again, just to, I'm going to plug the document and also add some clarification, right? Because and we actually debated this through our process as well. That does it make sense to give especially something like this, which spans multiple use cases? Does it make sense to give it an overall rating or try to rate it by use case, right? Because and we ultimately came to the conclusion that look, it makes most sense to split it by use case. Because what was happening there was, you have an app like Arogya Setu, which is trying to do 5-6 different things, and you're comparing it, or you're at least putting it in the same table as a simpler e-pass kind of app. Let's say city-based, right? It's in an area with high internet penetration. It's likely to do better on all counts, right? But it has, by that logic, a better viability rating on that use case. But that doesn't represent itself well when we put them all in one table, right? Which is why we actually rated Arogya Setu across multiple use cases, right? And it's a composite score of the population penetration, the privacy, and effectiveness. And obviously, I think one factor that's weighed heavily against it is the fact that no matter which way you cut it, population penetration is going to be an issue in a country like India, where very few people have access to. By few people, I mean in terms of percentages, right? Do not have access to the right type of the hardware that supports, right? And I want to make a distinction here because I know there is also an IVRS concept that's out there with Arogya Setu, but the way we've looked at it is, yes, that is technically the same Arogya Setu branding, but as a technology, as an app, it's different, right? In the sense that an IVR is something that's powered by your normal voice network, right? It's not doing any actual contact tracing or that, right? So we've not factored that in your contact tracing kind of use cases, and I think it's important to point that out. But we also should talk about effectiveness, and Utkarsh has done a lot of work on that. So I think Utkarsh, why don't you speak to some of what you did around the effectiveness bit of it?
Sure. So I think, as we have already talked about privacy and population penetration, but with effectiveness, we need to understand is that we are only looking at whether the app is able to achieve whatever its stated result is. So if an app which says contact tracing, it's supposed to do contact tracing, whether it is able to do that or not, irrespective of the fact that it takes howsoever much data it wants and howsoever much population is able to access that app through their mobile devices, right? So most of the interventions that we see now are using in technologies like Bluetooth Low Energy or global positioning systems to either contact trace or quarantine manage, or the other three use cases which you talk about being risk determination, informatory, and e-pass. So as Prateek already mentioned, because these technologies work differently for different use cases, we'll have different effectiveness ratings for all of these, right? So starting with contact tracing, say when we use GPS location for contact tracing, we probably might not be able to identify people who have come in close contact. So, for example, if both of us are working in the same office, we are sitting in two different rooms which are adjacent to each other. Your GPS location might tell us that we are close to each other, but because there's a wall and we do not talk to each other, say, it will be we would not have come into contact, which probably a Bluetooth would have been able to capture. So a Bluetooth signal attenuates because of obstructions such as walls or ceilings or doors. Here, in this case, this attenuation would have told us that even though you and I were sitting close to each other, but we were not in actual direct close contact. So these are some of the ways in which different technologies work differently for different applications. So even relying solely on GPS, as I said, could result in a high number of false positives and false negatives, which has its own set of problems. Slightly related to this is that when we have apps which store all the GPS locations centrally, that can also have problems because of the risk associated with centrally stacked databases because of phishing risk or hacking risk or security risk for that matter. However, we also talk about in the document that store GPS locations locally in our phones. They can actually help people in aiding their memory if and when manual contact tracing is required. Although we have seen and we have read and talked about reservations related to Bluetooth, about people talking about problems related to Bluetooth regard to precision and range and sometimes interference as well. We still believe that at an overall level for contact tracing, Bluetooth works slightly better than GPS. Coming to our second use case, which is quarantine management, for most quarantine management interventions are actually using GPS-based location and image recognition and to actually see if quarantine people are staying put in their homes or in quarantine centers or not. So we have seen stories about Karnataka authorities asking people for their selfies every hour, if I remember correctly. Now, there are a bunch of problems here. If you do it manually, we are not sure if we have the capacity to manually scrutinize images of thousands of people every hour, right? And if you do it algorithmically, there's another bunch of problems because, as we all know, that facial recognition is still developing and the accuracy of many of these softwares is maturing. And right now we are seeing a lot of false positives and false negatives. So besides GPS-based location data and image metadata are both susceptible to manipulation as well, right? So what I would say here is there's no golden way to do it, but we need to make sure that we are not denying people rights. It's when we institute an intervention which can impact a lot of people.
All right, thanks for that. The one other thing, and finally what I want to talk about, is your first recommendation in the doc. You have an executive summary, which is extremely helpful. Shout out to Takshita's reverse Bollywood format. Thanks for doing that. But the first point in the executive summary is that there should be some sort of stimulus that talks about it addresses the inequity of internet access. Now, I'm not sure what kind of stimulus this would be, and I don't want to ask the question here. But what I do want to ask is, what was the motivation behind having this as your first recommendation, and why is this more important than, let's say, something like privacy in this document?
No, so I wouldn't go as far as saying one is more important than the other, right? Again, even in terms of the way we've scored it, it's not that we've given one criteria significantly higher rating than the other. So yeah, we're not making the case that one of these criteria is more important than the other in any sense. But one of the reasons for putting that first was while looking at this, right, we also thought through some of the trade-offs that you have to make, and one of them is in such a situation you need to do a trade-off between equity and expediency, right? Now, in this scenario, we were there's no denying the fact that internet access was inequitable the way the market has played played out in India, right? Especially with regards to these particular technologies. Now, the important thing to note is that if we're going to rely on these technologies to support our efforts, right, then it makes sense for more and more people to have them, right, to have access to it. And more importantly, and this is not something that we've necessarily touched, we've not touched in this report, but the fact that, in a world where physical distancing is likely to be the norm for some time going forward, we are going to see more and more activities shift online, right? Access is going to play a major part going forward, right? We're already seeing, school classes, etc. All that is moving online, right? And we're seeing stories of people who are disadvantaged because of that, right? So the inequity of internet access is broader than just the scope of what's in this document, and that's why we've put it up front.
So apart from the inequity point, what are some of the other recommendations that your document describes?
Something which we found equally important, as Prateek had earlier mentioned, and Utkarsh had also mentioned, how we're looking at these three aspects and giving them equal importance. However, as you had pointed out sometime earlier, there is a general perception that we get through the analysis that such interventions have not factored in privacy while they were getting designed. So that is another major recommendation we've made, that a privacy-preserving model should be what needs to be focused on while keeping the other two aspects in the picture. This should not be undervalued while designing tech interventions, because these are moving forward going to be more expansive. Their reach might go up really far, and without having, so hence the next point, that without having any legislation, in the absence of any legislation on data protection and with the collection of extensive amounts of data, it is important that there be a privacy-preserving model that we follow while designing these interventions, and also that there must be an effective legislation with a focus on having a sunset clause, because certainly this cannot go on forever. Like, the pandemic will come to an end. However, these interventions, it's very difficult for intrusive interventions to be taken off the guard once they have even set foot in a little bit. So having sunset clauses that way is very important. So those two are also major recommendations we've made about having a legislation now in the absence, especially in the case of India, in the absence of a data protection law, while other countries like UK and Australia are looking at legislations for the purpose of COVID itself. It is a more so important aspect for India because of the lack of a data protection law. And in the same vein, it's important that we also look at having proofs of concept, because we are rolling out, at least in India particularly, that we are rolling out interventions directly to the masses rather than having them checked, or rather than having the proofs of concept run through a trial. It is important that we also look at what could be the negative effects, or what are the aspects which these interventions do not consider or fail to consider, the ones which miss out, so that we could improve. Because the ultimate objective of having technology and using technology through the pandemic is to help in the larger picture. So that should not be the cause of another problem, or another, as recently some authors have called it, that should not, the amount of data collected and the amount of technology used should not become the cause of another pandemic, which might or might not be a physical pandemic, but it could have grave consequences in the longer term. And also the denial of rights part, the exclusionary aspect of such technologies, particularly in the case of India, that is something which must not be factored out while we look at use of technology to help in the pandemic and controlling it. Because while it is important to have certain technological measures taken to aid in controlling the pandemic, it is also important that we do not leave out people and this does not lead to people losing their rights, and this creating a civil rights situation, that it should not lead to a problem of people having their basic necessities getting fulfilled. So in the case that we are mandating certain apps, which is a wonderful step that the government has come out and rolled back its interest in mandating the use of Arogya Setu. Because there are multiple aspects which do not get factored in while taking decisions like this. And it also leads to a lot of loss of civil rights. It leads to infringement of rights, starting from the right to privacy. It could even move to the basic rights of right to go to work, right to have your freedom of speech and expression, right to move. There are implications are massive. And these are also our recommendations also factor in for civil rights. Our recommendations also factor in for preserving the ideal of our welfare state.
Yeah, I guess if I can sum that up, right, it's basically advocate for basically using technologies, but also being inclusive while doing it, right? I think that's really the key. One line, if I can try to summarize it in, right? Although it's a lot more than that. And I would recommend, go and read the document. Let us know what you think.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining in. I'm looking forward to the document, and I think it's coming out later next week. So we'll also try to link the document in the show notes below if it's available then. And we also link the Twitter handles of Prateek, Utkarsh and Sapni so that you can find the document over there as well. All right. So thank you so much, guys.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. Do definitely check out our social media accounts. We've been doing some really cool stuff over there. There are a bunch of recommendations from hosts. I think you'll really enjoy the content that we're putting out there. And make sure you don't miss your favorite shows. Cyrus Says has been putting out some great stuff, as is the Pragati podcast, all about policy. Has been doing some really, really fun stuff. The guys at Football Shitball and Football Twaddle are continuing to release episodes as well, which are really interesting. Paisa Vaisa Anupam's been having guest after guest, just killing it. Pulia Bazi's been doing so well. Postcards from Nowhere. All these shows are really, really doing well and really, really putting out great stuff. Appreciate the efforts that the hosts are putting in the lockdown. And thanks for listening, and we hope to catch you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story-sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives, and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Storysellers for personal stories, analysis, and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.